Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, Happy New Year. Let me start off by saying whether you're a regular listener or this is your first time trying us out, we are so grateful to have you. I'm Alexis Dry. I'm joined every weekday by Dr. James Emery White. And we're going to jump in today with some reflection, because when reflecting on this past year, I wonder how many of us, honestly, could have predicted all that unfolded. Even if you gave yourself a pretty wide margin for surprises, I think few would go as far as to say that they predicted, for example, Biden's sudden departure from the presidential race, the fast revolt in Syria that led to the fall of Assad, North Korean troops in Europe, pager explosions in Lebanon, and let us not forget that surprise double album that Taylor Swift released back in April. In fact, I heard one Christian say recently that he simply assumed the worst at the beginning of last year so that he might just be pleasantly surprised when it did not all come to pass. And that is certainly one way to approach a new year. Now, Jim, you recently released a blog with some predictions of your own for 2025. And I don't think you'd disagree that while it may not have contained worst case scenario predictions, your list certainly isn't what I would call optimistic. We don't have time to walk through all of the predictions, though, so I encourage our listeners to check out your blog, which we'll link to in the show notes. Or if you have a moment, you can just quickly pop over to churchandculture.org to read that. But I do want to dig deeper into a few of them today. So your first couple of predictions focus on the ever-growing emphasis placed on ideology over theology within Christian churches. And this is something that you've talked about before, and again, we'll link those conversations in the show notes. But let me ask you about what ideological issues you maybe have in mind, particularly with the presidential election behind us now.
Well, let's make sure that we really understand a couple of things. I really can't stress enough what a massive cultural shift this is within the life of the North American church. This is something unprecedented in my lifetime. The church has always had internal divisions. It's always had things that kind of brought, various tribes together, but they were always ecclesiastical or theological. They were never ideological. By ecclesiastical, I mean they were things that related to the form and function of the church, how we do church. Are we going to be liturgical? Are we going to be contemporary? Are we going to have smells and bells? Or are we going to have drums and coffee? And that always was, something that I think you could make a case goes all the way back to the New Testament, the high church at Rome versus the more charismatic church at Corinth. But so you have ecclesiastical divides like that. You also had theological divides, that usually had something to do with the ecclesiology. Things like, should women be involved in ministry and charismatic worship and speaking in tongues? These were the things that, yes, churches had very strong opinions on, and often was the formation of denominations and various other things. So you had theology, you had ecclesiology, but you never had ideology. You really didn't have ideology. Nothing like what we have now. And what I mean by that is things have nothing to do with Christian theology. Or if you're saying it is rooted on Christian theology, you're on very, very, very thin ice and very thin support. So let me tell you what I mean by this. So, for example, you have people who are trying to find identity or looking for churches that agree with them ideologically, that agree with them politically, which is brand new. I'm not saying that all ideology is irrelevant, and I'm not saying that politics don't matter. I'm just saying that we've never based Christian community on it, and we certainly haven't picked a church on it over and above theology. So, for example, rather than a church's doctrine of Christ, or whether they believe in biblical authority, or whether they believe in the atonement of Jesus, his death, atoning work on the cross, whether they believe in the Trinity, these things aren't even asked, aren't even cared about. It's more like, okay, where do you stand on immigration? Did this church support Donald Trump or Kamala Harris in the last election? Are you woke? Where do you stand on critical race theory? What about immunizations? Do you think people should have them or be forced? Were you closed or open during COVID? Do you mask or not mask? It's like, and this is like new. And so that's what I mean by I think that ideology is going to continue, at least in the short term, to be a defining mark of gatherings and how people's. Now, I do think that it's not going to be healthy. It isn't healthy, and I think that it's going to be churches that are purposefully catering to it will find that they're not going to be altogether pleased with who they've attracted, because if that's a person's priority over theology, that tells you something about their relationship with Jesus. And it's not a question of whether what they hold to ideologically is right or wrong. It's just that if you put ideology over theology, that is just a serious mistake. And the truth of the matter is that Christians can have differing ideas about how best to handle the border and having a secure border as well as caring for human beings. You can have differences of opinion and still be Christians and still be in community. And but when you have a particular approach that has to be almost elevated to the level of orthodoxy, then you really have I would consider dangerous territory. So, and so I think that this is what I mean, where you're more interested in whether a church thinks we ought to support Ukraine or not than whether or not it should be about evangelism.
So, along these tribalistic lines, you predicted that many churches will continue narrowing actually their theological identity by adding so many doctrines to whatever category of essentials that they hold to, that it will even board on the cultic, is what you wrote. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it runs on a parallel track, the ideology over theology, and then you've got kind of doing the same thing, but theologically, where you have an ever increasing number of theological things where you do elevate the importance of theology. But here's what you do. You take things that are tertiary and you make them primary. You take things that are non-essentials and you make them essentials. You take things that thinking, thoughtful Christians have disagreed about for 2,000 years that were never central to historic Christian orthodoxy, that were never a part of the Nicene Creed, and you elevate them to that level. And so instead of like the Apostles' Creed and however many points that might have, you keep adding and adding and adding and adding things that Christians have disagreed about, and yet you're making them now a test of orthodoxy. And so it's kind of like where you have all these ideological things now that have all these boxes have to be checked off ideologically before I'll fellowship with you, before this church passes the muster. This is a little bit different, but similar in spirit. We're going to add a lot more theological boxes to be ticked before we consider you a Christian and we consider you orthodox. And I think it's very concerning. And let me give you an example. And I don't mind giving this as an example. Even though people who are listening to this blog can have differences of opinion on this, I think it's an example of what I'm talking about. Saddleback Community Church is one of the largest and most influential Southern Baptist churches in recent history, pastored by arguably the most well-known Southern Baptist pastor in recent history until his retirement, Rick Warren. And Rick's a friend of mine. And so, just full disclosure. But Rick is, if anybody who knows Rick on the theological spectrum, he is to the right. The man is extremely conservative. He holds to the inspiration and authority of the Bible, including its inerrancy. He simply came to the conclusion that an informed, balanced, careful interpretation of the Bible does not preclude women from serving in pastoral roles. Not exactly a shocker, and he's not alone in the conservative evangelical world. The person, it's interesting how a lot of people who kind of whooped up on Rick, were big fans of the late Tim Keller. But Tim Keller was known as the John Stott of America, the leading thinking pastor theologian. Well, John Stott embraced women as pastors. There's an irony there. Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, which, full disclosure, I used to be president of, but it was founded by such evangelical luminaries as Billy Graham and Harold John Ockenga, embraces women serving as pastors. My own voice may not mean much, but I too have made my hermeneutical convictions clear on this as well. This is a hermeneutical disagreement. That's what it is. To say otherwise is just completely disingenuous. But it is a hermeneutical disagreement. But they disfellowshipped, Rick. The Southern Baptist Convention disfellowshipped. It kicked them out of the convention over women in ministry. They elevated that to that level. Now, you may say, well, I think that one should be. Well, okay, we can agree to disagree on that. But look at all the things that are being elevated to that level. I just use that as an example. Women in ministry, Calvinism, whether you have elder rule or congregational rule, the nature of church discipline and how that should operate, the amount of authority a pastor should have over a congregation, whether you are multi-site or not multi-site. These things have been elevated to matters of orthodoxy. And I even though I have strong opinions on all of those things, I am not prepared to say that. I am not a Calvinist, as we've had a podcast on, but I'm not going to look at I would say a Calvinist brother or sister and say that you are somehow now out of the fold. So this is new, that we've elevated what used to be tertiary things, honest disagreements, theological debates, and we've made where you stand on an ever increasing number of them. And so you have this tight, the test of orthodoxy. So you have this smaller and smaller and smaller circle of who's right and, who's wrong. And then it reminds me of, there's a story, and I think it's hurting the church. Obviously, it's hurting the church. There's an old story that about a castle that was continually being ravaged by scavengers. And so the nobleman who had it ordered that a wall be built around the castle to protect it. And they said, well, where do you want the stones to come from for the wall? And he says, I don't really care. Just build the wall around, just build the wall. And so months later, he came to see what had been accomplished. And he found this large, imposing wall around the side of the castle. Once he got through the gate, he found the castle gone. The workmen had used the castle for the stones needed to build the wall. The point is, avoid defending the castle in such a way that the castle itself is destroyed. A wall might be built, but it can be built sometimes at the expense of the castle. And what I have found is that when you are all about what you're against, or you're just full of acrimony, or you're trying to have a narrower theological sense of orthodoxy, as opposed to a broader mere Christianity that C.S. Lewis espoused and Richard Baxter before him. When you have that kind of that sense of, well, we're going to win, we're going to take over, we're going to oust anybody that disagrees with us. When you have that kind of mentality, then once you win on a particular issue or on a particular matter, it doesn't end. That kind of energy, that kind of negative energy just restless till it finds another enemy, another cause, something else to demonize, something else to make a fight over. The spirit of division doesn't have a natural ending. I mentioned the Southern Baptist Convention. In 1988, there were 33,000 people present there. If my memory serves, I was one of them back when I was involved with the SBC. At 33,000 delegates. In 2023, there were 12,000. It's a dramatic decline, and they continue to have declined with membership and baptisms. They may have built the wall. They destroyed the castle. Or at least it seems to be in bad shape.
Well, let's step outside of the church for a moment to talk about another one of your predictions, because you predicted that our culture will increasingly box out any area in which we might want to make a spiritual investment. And you mentioned particularly the area of parenting. Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah. And by the time this blog's over, people would say, well, he's just a cranky old man. But actually, you do reach a point to where you feel like it's very important to just call things out. And I welcome people to disagree with me. I welcome people to be, I just want to get their thinking certain, just consider. And so now that I've offended Southern Baptists and people who are Calvinists and everybody else, let me go after parents, and particularly parents in sports, because that's really the heart of this, and that's what studies have shown. And for in fact, Lifeway Research just did a massive study on this that they released about children and teenagers, and particularly the issue of travel sports. In 2022, those kids between the ages of 6 and 18 were involved in sports for an average of 16.8 hours a week. Don't you think about that? 16.8 hours per week. That's an Aspen. I brought it with me. That's an Aspen Institute report. That involves the travel time, involved during the weekends for games and tournaments. Okay, I am a father of four. I raised four kids. We were involved in sports. I was involved in sports as a boy. I like sports, believe in sports. I think they can be an important aspect of social development, and also just learning how to play with others and rules and sportsmanship. And there are a very, 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 very few number who could use them for potential financial scholarship to a college that maybe they or their family could not afford. Or obviously there are some that even much smaller number that do it professionally. But obviously the vast majority, 99.9%, that's not the case. And you already know it when you're investing this kind of time in it. So you're investing 17 hours a week at the exclusion of spiritual development, church involvement, other aspects of parenting and child development. I think this is a real problem. And what the study found was that the thing that suffered most was spiritual formation and church involvement, because that's obviously largely weekend based and traditionally Sunday morning based. And sports have increasingly gone into the Sundays, and they have taken over that for tournaments and travel and everything else. And so where's this 16.8 hours coming from? It's coming from the weekends, which day mostly. Sundays affected greatly. And so what's happening culturally is this is becoming not just accepted, but affirmed. And an increasing number of parents are being led to believe that they've got to do this for their child. They have got to do this. This is an absolute command performance. My child's future depends on it. Their development depends on it. Their socialization depends on it, none of which is true. So sports has been elevated, and I have just seen swim teams, basketball, all things AAU, just dominate a family when realistically that child doesn't have that kind of future in it that would warrant it. But they just get sucked into it, and they suffer spiritually, and in terms of church community, church involvement, and also just overall what those hours could have been gone for in other ways. So yeah, I think that that's something where culture, what's happening there is preventing or talking parents out of the making a spiritual investment, but instead they're making it over here in this other area.
Well, we took a nice break from the church, only to be hit with, as you said, more pessimism. And now we're going to go right back to the church again for a little bit more of that. Because several of your predictions actually have to do with the way that we do church. For example, you mentioned that hybrid approaches to ministry, so that involves physical and digital points of connection, that's going to grow more popular. And in contrast, you predicted that multi-site models will become less popular. You also wrote that churches will find themselves this year more concerned with, I'm quoting you said connecting than with gathering. Can you elaborate on that distinction?
Yeah, let's go back to the multi-site thing before we get into the connecting versus gathering thing. That's actually another great example of where people wanted to almost elevate a particular approach to ministry to the level of orthodoxy or orthopraxis, more to the point, better term, right actions. So I remember back in the 1980s, when I worked for a short stint for what used to be called the Baptist Sunday School Board. It's now Lifeway. And I was the leadership consultant for preaching and worship. And I was essentially turned loose to research on the fastest growing churches, both in the SBC and outside of it, turn around and write about it for the denomination. So I was freed up to talk to any leader, travel to any church, see what was going on. And I used to joke back then, this is the seminary education nobody gets in seminary. That is, if you actually want to lead and build and grow a church. And I remember, that was when I mentioned Rick earlier. That's where I first met Rick. I heard about this church that was doing some innovative things and growing. And I remember I was out in Los Angeles. And I went out to Tribuca Hills High School where for a Saturday night service, helped him set up chairs. Just old days and other stories like that I could tell you. They're just a lot of fun. But I did a lot of research, and one of the things that I found was that the fastest growing churches were not growing through Sunday school; they were growing through their weekend worship service. And so I wrote a little book called "Opening the Front Door: Worship and Church Growth," that kind of capsulized what some of these churches were doing to throw open the front door to the unchurched. And I made the point, and it was through research, that Sunday school hadn't been the front door of the church since 1971. You would have thought that I had gotten on top of the world and said Jesus didn't die for our sins, because Sunday school was everything. Sunday school is how you grow your church. Sunday school is how you had community in your church. Sunday school was how you did evangelism in your church. Sunday school is how you did discipleship in your church. If global warming is ever a problem, Sunday school will solve global warming. I mean, it was that kind of cult-like mentality around it. It was a methodology that had been enshrined in orthodoxy, in orthopraxis, I should say. Well, it was so interesting to me that in 2019, when we made the decision here at MEC to move away from a multi-site approach, and we had been one of the pioneers, and we closed down all of our sites, but our 80-acre originating campus. I mean, the defensiveness was palpable. Like somehow, like you're attacking multi-site. How can you do that? This is an enshrined methodological whatever. And I remember at the time I tried to be very careful and went on various platforms and talking about it. I remember I did Carrie Newhoff's podcast and various other things talking about this, and said, look, the multi-site approach it's not good, bad, or indifferent. It's a methodology. If it works for you, do it. Mazel tov, blessings. I don't care. I said, but I do think that we need to talk about any methodology and ask if it's the most effective, and particularly for your particular church. And I brought out several things that led to our decision-making, such as we were increasingly finding it to be a dated approach. I mean, all things multi-site came to the fore back in the late 90s and early 2000s. We think of that as being this new cutting-edge thing. But in the late 90s, I mean, you're talking something that's over 35 years ago. That's kind of old in our fast-paced world. The earliest books written about it were over 20 years ago. Anyway, the whole and here's what really is interesting to think about. All the thinking and launch of multi-site, the first books on multi-site, everybody's saying this is the newfangled approach to go about multi-site, all happened in the late 90s, very early 2000s. And before we even had the iPhone in 2007, before our whole world changed dramatically with all things, the internet and all things online and all things hybrid. And I mean, my goodness. So it's dated. And what makes it dated is that it's a physical approach in a digital world. The whole multi-site approach was very simple. At least it was for us. We were trying to find a way to solve physical barriers for people to invite their unchurched friends to attend. And there was this sense that, they wouldn't go very far, and the only way to introduce them to church was physically. And so all of that changed. Today, geography are not the barriers that need to be removed, because that's not how people investigate a church. They go online. They check out your website. They check out an online campus. They check out a streaming service. They will spend quite a bit of time, if you hook them, online long before they ever surface physically. And they may never even want to surface physically if but that's how they're going to check you out. So everything that the multi-site was trying to overcome became inconsequential with the digital revolution, because that wasn't their first introduction. It was the initial invitation that was thwarted, that you needed to go, okay, well, let's have a site in your community then, because they're not going to drive 15 minutes. Well, now it's not even the 15-minute drive. You just want to try to get them on your website. And then if you hook them there, they'll drive 45 minutes. They don't care if they really want that physical, interaction. So I think that is a very important thing to think about. There's more about the multi-site and that we could talk about. But another dynamic with that is just good stewardship for us. The cost of a multi-site is huge. the cost of a site is huge. Physical plant, whether you lease, rent, buy, build, it's expensive. And it has to be staffed with at least 4 or 5 staff people. And there's also a huge toll on volunteers if you don't buy it. There's setup and there's breakdown. And anybody who's ever gone through setup and breakdown in a rented facility know that takes a toll on you. And using pipe and drape and creating rooms and all these kinds of things. Huge amounts of money. And I remember I had a defining moment, Lex, where and I'm chasing a whole bunch of rabbits, but still, before we made this decision, we went through a budget cycle. It was at the end of 2018, I remember. And you've been through this. We go through extensive budget process, involves lots of staff, and it's a very collaborative thing where people develop their own budgets for their ministries and goes through all kinds of stuff. Anyway, and when we got to the end, I was hearing from so many people of all the dreams of things that we could do online, what we could do with our website, how we could do this with digital marketing, how we could make this more user friendly with phones, and because most of the older websites didn't interface well with mobile technology, and on and on and on it went. Just all these things that could be done, and we didn't have the money for it because we were sinking so much money into multi-sites. And here was this huge potential of reaching untold numbers of people at the heart of our mission field, far from God. And we were investing all this money into bricks and mortar. And I just wanted to go in a corner and vomit. I just, as a leader. And so anyway, we made the decision and closed all of our sites in 2019. And then COVID hit. We looked a lot smarter than we were. But we'd already started making that whole move toward a hybrid model. And as you know, we have never grown faster since. And vast online community and reaching so many people, thousands and thousands of people we never would have reached. So, that was a little bit about, the multi-site thing. But this is why I talk about connecting versus gathering. There's a difference between those two things. In the past, the church has bet the farm on gathering. In fact, we've only had a gathering model. Let's gather on Sunday at 11 o'clock in a building for this worship experience, a gathering. And there's little doubt that we're to be worshipers, both public and private, and that one of the marks of the early church was gathering together to do just that. Yes, the author of Hebrews talks about let's not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but that had nothing to do with corporate worship. That verse in Hebrews is one of the most misinterpreted verses in the entire Bible. Corporate worship was neither the context nor the subject of that. Making it about compulsory in-person worship services has been designated by many people as one of the great urban legends of the New Testament. That's not what it means. It had to do with personal interactions with other Christians. It is less to do with going to a church service than it does with keeping an appointment with a friend at a Starbucks to encourage them on in their faith. But, churches have got to become digital. We've got to go hybrid in our approach, both digital and physical. And the people we're trying to reach are all going to be online. We're going to be reaching them digitally. And so churches are going to be these digital organizations with physical expressions, not physical organizations with a digital presence. And you see this sweeping, obviously, the retail world. Sears, JCPenney, Toys R Us, they had this older, more traditional model that placed an emphasis on, quite frankly, gathering. Big physical footprints, in-person shopping. And while people like to do in-person shopping, we all know that even if they go in person, they'll go home and click and buy. So it was just a hybrid model is just needed. And of course, all three of those that I mentioned had to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The point is the church needs to see its online presence and its online community as perhaps I would argue its primary medium for initiating growth. It's going to be absolutely instrumental for discipleship, using it that way, ministry, and yes, embodied community. Not to solely become an online entity. I've never argued for that. But we need to move away from just thinking about gathering and realizing that we really need to put the emphasis on connecting. Gathering can be a part of that connecting, but connecting is much larger than gathering. And we want to connect people as much as possible. In fact, we're going to have to connect people just to get them to gather. Connecting is the first step. and connecting them with them and connecting them to each other and to the church and so forth. So we need to invest in connecting people in whatever way they're willing to connect with us. And by and large, that's going to mean, online. And I would say that as we do that, we also need to rethink our definition of gathering. As I mentioned, we've made it all about a physical gathering in a building at a time, and you can gather in all kinds of ways. I was, I've have written about this. Like just think about this past weekend. Thousands of people gathered this past weekend at MEC. Thousands. We talked to each other, we engaged each other, we experienced a shared worship and teaching with each other. Phone numbers, emails were exchanged. People made plans to meet over coffee. We gave of our resources. We prayed with and for one another. Pastors were pastoring, counselors were counseling. People gave their lives to Christ. And all of this happened through a community gathering through an online campus. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am. He never said the manner of that gathering. And so I think that we need to have it be seen as, again, not pitting physical against the digital. There's pros and cons to both. I believe there's a lot of things that need to be embodied. I'm all for it. But let's quit making it an either or and realize it's a both and. And there can be a powerful synergism to that. And rightfully so. And so we've just never grown faster. We're breaking attendance records, both in-person attendance records, so fast. I don't even notify the staff every week when we do it, because it's just like we did. You don't know this. We did another one this past weekend.
Wow.
We set a new in-person attendance record. I didn't even send out an email to staff because I'll wait until the staff meeting because it's happening. It's just almost dangerously close to weekly. But it's that synergism that comes with being hybrid, both. Anyway, enough on that. I move on.
Well, lest anyone would get the impression that, we should give this blank check to digital innovation. I know that's not what you would suggest. Let's pivot over to talk about AI. I do feel like as society, we seem very quick to embrace its benefits without giving a lot of time for thoughtful reflection on its potential dangers. And yet a critical component of that reflection has to be the Christian doctrine of humanity, as you've talked about. In fact, you predicted that no greater doctrine of Christian faith will be under more attack this year. Can you riff on that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, my PhD was in systematic theology. I had areas in church history and biblical studies. I did 3 majors, if you would, in my PhD, but one was systematic theology. And I've been a professor of theology and culture, and I have long told my theology students, my graduate students, that the doctrine of humanity is by far the most pressing doctrine of our day in regard to culture, for it is the area that is most challenged by the world in which we live, and the one where we have done the least amount of reflection. We have had the least to draw from historically. I mean, I defy anyone who's a student of theology to find a reflection from Origen or Athanasius or Luther or Melanchthon or Barth or Brunner that speaks to stem cell research or human cloning or transsexualism or artificial intelligence. The first 5 centuries, if you study the history of theology, historical theology, which is an interesting way of studying theology as well, as opposed to systematic or biblical theology, there's different ways of approaching theology. But historical theology, if you look at it that way, the first 5 centuries hammered out Christology. Later generations tackled everything from the Holy Spirit to the doctrine of revelation. Ours may be the day that is forced to examine the doctrine of humanity in ways that I don't think any other generation has been forced to do, and in ways that hopefully will serve the church for years to come. And so when people say, well, what do you mean? How is all this tied with the doctrine of humanity? Artificial intelligence raises the question of what is consciousness. Transsexual issues, all things trans. What is gender? What is the basis of sexual identity? What does it mean to be male or female, or to be made male or female? The very basis of creation in Genesis. Abortion, the real question there is, when does life begin? And not just life, but ensoulment, which is something that is not wrestled with very often. When does ensoulment take place? When is that fetus a person? Euthanasia. When does life end? When does personhood end? When does, desoulment take place, if you will? And when you're faced with a critical issue with a loved one in a hospital. Genetic engineering. How far are we allowed to tinker with the human stock? On and on it goes. I just listed all those topics. Those are arguably the top issues of our cultural day. One or two might not be on there. Every single one of them has to do with the doctrine of humanity. And only the clear thinking and reflection of the doctrine of humanity is the only way we can interact with those questions and present a Christian apologetic in terms of how to think Christianly about them.
I was joking earlier that we should title this podcast "The Slide into the Abyss," based on something that you wrote in your blog, because you noted that decivilization is going to continue at a frightening pace, and you wrote, leading us even closer to an eventual slide into the abyss. Can you talk, while we're on the topic of inventing words, decivilization, now, can you talk about what's making that slide slippier? I'm going to add that one, slippier than usual.
Slipperier.
I
think that, it's interesting. I'm shocked that Christians are not the ones talking about this. Secular cultural observers are the ones saying, like, they're looking around saying, does anybody else see all this decivilization taking place? Christians aren't. But a lot of that's because in some cases Christians are a part of it. And that's another conversation. But it's interesting that some of the best thinking and best writing on decivilization has come from the Atlantic, where they've done 2 or 3 different things on it that are spot on. For example, there was very little outcry, surprisingly, in the Christian community with the murder of the health insurance executive Brian Thompson in Midtown Manhattan. And not just his murder, but the fact that people cheered his execution. They were happy because they had anger toward the healthcare industry. And, Christians many of them were just silent over that. Whereas many in the secular world said, wait a minute, where is our humanity? This was a human being with, I think, 2 young children who was murdered in cold blood. Feel what you want about the healthcare industry, but my gosh, this was murder of a human being. And people cheered it, celebrated it, memes flowed everywhere, saying happy, happy, and making the killer a hero. Okay, that's decivilization. That's a slide into the abyss when that is celebrated and a murderer is made a hero. And like where was the outcry? But but the heart of the decivilization, this came from another, and I agree with this, Pete Weiner at in another article in the Atlantic. He called it dehumanization, and where people were not seeing this man as a human, not a human. You're not seeing other people are objects. And when they're objects or they're vilified or they're enemies, or because they're an enemy, you can dehumanize them. And you saw this happen in COVID. This really went, just like got jet fuel during COVID, and we talked about it, is that when I can demonize someone who I disagree with, and I can make them less than human. And once I do that, I can say, do, think, or act any way I want toward them. Because we disagree and they're wrong and they're the enemy. And if they're the enemy, I can dehumanize them in a way that I can act in extraordinarily evil ways toward them. And that we all know that happened and is happening with dehumanization. And we just don't, our hearts don't even grieve with people anymore. It's funny, I linked 2 stories together that probably nobody else did, but they hit me with this dehumanization. One was the murder of Brian Thompson in Midtown Manhattan, the health insurance executive, and people cheering his execution, his murder. And then the tragic story of this to me, this young girl, Lily Phillips, 23 years old, which to me is just a borderline child at my age. But this young girl living in London who made headlines for having sex with 100 men in 24 hours. And she did it as a publicity stunt for her OnlyFans page. And then, but a serious filmmaker did a documentary on it, posted it on YouTube, and it went viral, and it created a national conversation. And it was, and the actual video on YouTube that chronicled it was didn't show any of the sex or any of that. It was just the lead up to it, kind of an interview of her and then how she was afterward. There's no nudity or no sex or anything. It was just chronicling this young girl's life. And I watched it, and I was heartbroken. I was almost in tears at the end. I mean, it was probably one of the most strongest apologetics against anybody getting involved in pornography or watching pornography that you'll ever have. But she was interviewed afterward. He was asking her, so how are you doing? How are you feeling? And she just burst into tears, at almost how she had dehumanized herself. And she said, I don't know that I'd ever recommend anybody doing what I just did. But people reacting to her, many just said, oh, you just got what you deserve. You just got what you deserve. And I'm sitting there going, this is a 23-year-old child who obviously, forgive me, but I would say clearly was not fathered, clearly was not loved, clearly did not have a stable home environment, clearly is lost, clearly needs Jesus. And it's just someone who should go wrap their arms around her and say, dear child, let me help you. And there was one reaction that I thought was right. One person on X responded, it is a damning, and I brought this, it is a damning indictment of our society that we see a young woman engaging in dangerous behavior and struggling mentally while putting herself in these harmful situations, and we merely scoff and declare that she deserves it. So different cases of where we just are dehumanizing others and going into a process of decivilization as well.
Well, before we end, so as to not leave all of our listeners in the fetal position when we're done, let me ask you one more question. As dire as these predictions might be, do you have any hope that there's a silver lining here?
Yes.
Okay.
I think with all of this, and this is, it's funny when I give these predictions, I want to wake the church up. I want to wake people up. I'm not trying to just be despondent or discouraged, but wake up and realize what the front is. And for me, that's what energizes me, is that we're in a battle. I mean, there's no time for apathy or lethargy. I mean, this is why I get up in the morning, is to engage this. So, yes, I mean, in terms of, if there is increasing persecution, for example, in our world, I think that'll lead to deeper conviction and commitment within the church, like it has in every other time of conviction. Artificial intelligence and things like it will challenge us to deepen our doctrine of humanity and help us to be better thinkers and better apologists and to engage the world more clearly. A hybrid model of the church, don't be scared by it, don't fight it. Embrace it as an expansion of the Great Commission and the broadening of community. The fields are wide unto harvest. Everybody you're trying to reach is online. So let's get after it. So be encouraged by that. The shallowness of ideology, I hope, leads to a return to theology. I think the shrinking understanding of of making so many things orthodox and making who is in and who is out smaller and smaller and smaller, I think hopefully will spur us on to recapture a broader vision of mere Christianity as we try to band together. I think that, as parents maybe begin to see losing their children, that 16.8 hours a week with travel sports isn't working, in terms of their soul and their character and their relationship with Christ. Maybe it'll help them reprioritize parenting and reprioritize their commitment to the church and to spiritual things. And so I'm hopeful, that even though these are trends, they can all be things that when they either train wreck or run out of gas or they're seen for what they are, they'll be our big wake-up call to do, live, think differently, and all to the greater glory of God.
Well, thank you, Jim, for taking the time to walk us through those. As I mentioned, there's more that we didn't get a chance to talk to today, so check out that blog if you haven't had a chance to already. If this was your first time, I hope you enjoyed it.
And I'm glad we did this, and thank you, Alex, because the blog was almost like bullet points without any elaboration, so it may be even more stark reading.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to unpack some of these. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next week.